Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to old friends and newcomers to the Schemmel Forum's second World Affairs Luncheon Seminar of the fall semester. There's nothing more worldly, urbane, cosmopolitan than the city, is there? Cities have been the centers of learning, commerce, and culture through the centuries and on every continent. While suburbanites and rural dwellers sometimes shudder at the mere thought of the city, and some are even proud of not having been in a city for years, we here don't suffer from that urbanophobia. I don't know if that's really a word, but you know what I mean. Today's speaker is Owen Gutfreund, who will talk about how cities make the world better, past, present, and future. He will offer a new perspective on our love-hate relationship with cities by opening our minds to their important role in the modern world, and indeed their important role in the history of the world. Owen is Associate Professor of Urban Affairs and Planning at Hunter College. For many years, he was the director of the Barnard-Columbia Urban Studies program. His perspective on cities is global and comprehensive, and in fact, he knows quite a bit about our city, as he's the son-in-law of our most faithful Schemmel Forum member, Mary Rhodes. Please join me in welcoming Owen to the podium.
Thank you, Sandra, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you all for turning out to hear what I have to say. As Sandra said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of cities. I hope that I will give you some food for thought, make you rethink whatever it is your understanding is of cities. And I'm going to do that by, first of all, talking about what cities have done for us and give you a snapshot of where we are in the world today with cities, and then give you, I hope, some provocative possibilities for how cities can be our salvation in the future. I'm going to skip the obvious piece of cities, which is cities as a location of cultural production where we all benefit from everything from high culture to low culture, and the great museums and theater, and also mass culture. If you think about the city of Los Angeles and the movie industry and the television industry, the way it was born and prospered in New York, skipping that and talk about the city as a local locus of other important things. First of all, appropriate for a forum on global concepts and world affairs, I'd like to talk about cities as a location of great advances since the 18th century. I'm going to try to cover not only the whole world, but some time here. So let's go back to the 18th century, and we can look at cities are places where key political change, key economic change, cultural change, social change, and since over the last 300 years, and also technological innovation. A lot of the things that have changed the human condition have happened in cities, and for the most part, those are changes for the better. And they happen in cities for a variety of reasons that mostly have to do with that's where all the people are, that's where there's a critical mass of expertise, but it's also where in cities you get economies of scope. We're all familiar with the idea of economies of scale that we hear about. The more of something you make, the more your fixed costs are spread over lots of units, and it costs less per unit to make it. So if you make more, it's more efficient. What we often forget to learn about in economics courses is the notion of economies of scope, which has to do with the diversity of production. And what happens in cities is the more different stuff is going on, the more efficient each piece is. And that's one of the reasons why change and innovation tends to happen in cities. But let me back up here and talk about the historically the political changes that happen in cities. First of all, again, going back to the 18th century, where does the American Revolution really happen? When you study the American Revolution, you're mostly studying Boston and Philadelphia. We think about things like the Boston Tea Party. We think about founding fathers meeting in Boston. The committees of correspondence. Committees of correspondence are not meeting on the farm. They're meeting in the cities. And in Philadelphia, that's where things like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution happened. Talk about two documents that really changed the direction of the world in many ways. Similarly, also from the 18th century, when you think of the French Revolution, often the first thing you think of is the storming of the Bastille in Paris, in the city. Important political change for the better. This continues into the 20th century. If we imagine one of the biggest political global moments of the 20th century was the experiment and then collapse with communist socialism. And the symbols of that collapse, we think of the Berlin Wall, and the Berlin Wall going up and the Berlin Wall coming down. We think of, in China, Tiananmen Square, right in the heart of the city. And that continues in the 21st century, going on as we speak. The world became aware of the Arab Spring, and it started earlier, but when did we become aware of it, and when did it gain the momentum to spread to other countries, was when everybody noticed what was going on in Tahrir Square in the middle of Cairo, a city of millions of people. And radical political change, I would be remiss if I didn't also point out the iconic image of one of the great political and ideological conflicts of our time is the image of the smoking destruction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center after being attacked on September 11th in 2001. By the way, I would say evidence of the fact that that attack was evidence of the fact that everywhere in the world except the US, people understand that New York is of America and America is of New York. And for a moment, we remembered that and came together as a nation, but really quickly people started thinking of New York as other again. And I think that's an exercise in deception. I don't think we can separate our cities from ourselves, although people might imagine that that's a possibility. I'm reminded here, and I just want to offer you the saying that we've all heard many times about New York, but about lots of other cities. Great place to live, great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. And I want to come back to that because I think that must change if we're going to be able to successfully inhabit this planet for generations to come. And that's where I'm going to end. But let me return to this idea of the city as other and contrary to notions of Americanism. And this is what I call the myth of the rural America. Well, before I do that, I'll come back to that. Cities not just as a location of violent and revolutionary tumult, because all the things I mentioned were revolutionary political change, but also incremental change. You can go back not even to the 18th century, to the early 16th century. Martin Luther, after he thought about a variety of things in monastic retreat, ends up going to the city of Wittenberg to post his 95 Theses and provide momentum for the Protestant Reformation. But other incremental things closer to home. In the US, if you think about the movement towards political equality for women, or the movement towards a fair and equitably multiracial society, the two images that come to mind for many people is suffragettes marching in Union Square in New York City, right in the heart of the city, over and over again. There were multiple marches. Or in the other case, we think of not Martin Luther, but Martin Luther King and his inspiring speech right in the middle of Washington, D.C. But this is not just a story that I want to tell you of cities and political change. Let me give you some examples of cities as central to economic and social change. First of all, 19th century Europe. So we're getting a little bit closer to the present here. In the 19th century, not just because of the French Revolution and the American Revolution that coincided with it, but for economic and social reasons, the economic and social order of Europe was unsustainable, and that became apparent to people at all levels of society in the 19th century. And that produced a steady migration from rural Europe and small-town Europe to cities. Some to European cities, some to cities elsewhere. That's because life on the farm, so to speak, was not sustainable anymore. And the entire social and economic order of Europe was based on the idea that there were certain people that would stay on the farm. Many people moved to cities because there were better prospects there, and in European cities that still reproduced in an urban setting the same inflexible social and political and economic order that they'd experienced in the countryside, many of the people that moved to European cities found that that was not adequate and looked elsewhere outside of Europe. Not just the US. In the US, we tend to imagine that European immigration means going from Europe to the US. Not the case. This was a global migration compared to today on a small scale of things weren't working well in Europe, so there's a global migration looking for better elsewhere. A lot of those people came to the US, but this was the time period in which, over the course of only 40 or 50 years, Melbourne, Australia was started from scratch, founded, and surpassed the size of Boston. This is a time period in which, in the last half of the 19th century, Buenos Aires became an immigration destination and exceeded 1 million residents and became one of the 10 biggest cities in the world. Migrants to cities were seeking a better life. The familiar, the rural, non-urban was inadequate. There was not enough land. There were not enough jobs. There were insufficient options when there wasn't enough land, when one family had more than one child. You keep cutting the farm in half and it's not enough. So then there's the whole idea of second children, third children. What are they supposed to do? Go to the city. It was not unusual, by the way. The second child would go to a European city. The third child would have to go further away and would end up going to the US or to Australia or South America. So the better option that people were finding, as rural was not working, was cities, because cities were the location of industrial innovation. Cities were the location of new possibilities in a variety of ways, in particular, diverse possibilities in diverse urban economies. There might only be one or two kinds of jobs in the area that the people were leaving. And they were migrating to a place where they didn't quite know what they were going to do, but they knew there were lots of jobs there of all different kinds. Cities as a place of diverse opportunity. So one of the destinations is the US. The biggest, but not the only destination, was New York City. But not just as a destination itself, as a place to come that was a location of information. Information about what the next step might be. So even people who were planning on farming would come to New York to find out, where's the good farmland in the New World? How do I get there? They would come to New York, they would engage their existing information networks, or they would connect to new ones, find out where to go. So cities as a location not only of diverse possibilities there, but as a gateway to other diverse possibilities. Which leads me to the story of westward expansion in the US. And now we're coming back to the myth of rural America. The conventional version of the story of westward expansion in the US is a rural, agricultural, non-urban story. We have images of Conestoga wagons filled with families that are moving west, or we have images of Little House on the Prairie, or the Wilderness Family. All these, some are mass media images, but it's a strong cultural image. And this is wrong. This is just not actually an accurate picture of what westward expansion was. This did happen. People did go west in Conestoga wagons. But the real story of westward expansion, the one that's not ensconced in anti-urban American mythology, and is not built around a notion of agrarian authenticity and therefore urban the other. The real story is one in which cities were the spearheads of westward expansion. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But what I like to suggest is the central narrative of American identity perhaps isn't the notion of westward expansion. And if you're thinking, what about world affairs? I'm going to connect this to what's going on in the world today in a moment. The central narrative isn't one of westward expansion. The central narrative is one of immigration and migration. And that's how that's going to connect in a moment to what's going on in the world today. That's the real narrative of American identity, I think. Cities as the locus of immigration, where repeated, continual reformulation of what it means to be American. A place where things are in the cities with immigration as not static but dynamic, and not rooted in an ahistorical, anachronistic notion of a yeoman farmer. Where we're getting with that in the world today is there's this enormous migration going on. And I'm going to, in a few minutes, give you some details on the scale of that migration and what it means for us. But we must not retain static views of nations, places, continents, and their relations to each other, because sometimes those are misconstructed notions, as is our agrarian myth in America. And regardless of whether they're misconstructed, they're moving. And so we have to be looking at, I'm an historian, I'm not going to say that the past doesn't matter, but we can't believe that the future will be the past. The reason to study the history is to understand change, not to assume that history will repeat itself. What repeats itself is the process of change. And so that saying we hear about, history repeats itself, is misleading. Understanding the process of change helps us figure out how we can enact change moving forward. That's what repeats itself, is the continuing change. And if we don't learn how the change happens, then we will repeat the mistakes of history. That's a different way of looking at that story. Okay, so going back to where I was here, a dynamic place in cities that have again and again incorporated multiple ethnicities, multiple religions, and also generated and incorporated world-changing technological innovations. The diversity of the urban economies allow changes much more readily than less diverse economies. Outside the window here, we have a view of a small city that did not have a diverse economy and struggled when coal and steam power were no longer driving forces. You can look at Detroit as a big city that did not have a diverse economy. Pittsburgh, there's cities all over the world, but the big mega cities growing today are increasingly diverse and increasingly resilient, and really are the places where innovations are going to help us move forward. Okay, back to the westward expansion notion and the idea that cities were at the forefront of westward expansion. Where do we come up with the misbegotten idea that it was the other? Well, a lot of it goes back to Frederick Jackson Turner. I think many of you have heard of Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. When JFK spoke about space as the final frontier, this was a reference, not just the Star Trek series, but that was JFK used the phrase the first time in public speaking that we know of. That was a reference back to Frederick Jackson Turner, who in 1892 or 1893 at the Chicago Exposition said, "We have reached the West Coast, and this will produce a fundamental change in American character, because we have been, what has made us what we are is this process of moving west and expanding our territory. And now the frontier is closed." And the way he described the frontier, it was always about settlers followed by cities. As a practical matter, other scholars have come along since then. We have learned something in the last 120 years since Turner spoke. In particular, I want to reference a guy named Richard Wade and another person named William Cronin. Wade came along and discovered that even the development of the interior between the East Coast and the Mississippi was led by cities. You would first have settlements at the falls of a great river, where Cincinnati is, or where great rivers met other great rivers, where St. Louis ends up. You would first end up with trading posts, urban settlements, and those would facilitate and support the rural settlement of the region. And this happened hand in hand. You could not have the rural settlement without the urban. And it's a mistake to think of them as separate. Cities and westward expansion were in parallel. So between immigration and that revised view, but William Cronin came along and added a whole other dimension to this. And what William Cronin talked about was the development of the whole Midwest, which at the time was called the Great West, and Chicago. And he really dug in deep, and what he discovered, and what I want to share with you here, is the idea that the entire Midwest, what we think of as the American hinterland in a lot of ways, was inextricably tied with the growth of Chicago. And we would not have the American hinterland the way we understand it today if we didn't have the big city with 1 million residents in Chicago, and vice versa. And this was because of crucial innovations, urban innovations, that facilitated the settlement of the countryside. In Chicago's case, when I say innovations, it's not just the technology of, say, mechanizing agriculture with the McCormick Reaper, but it was also financial technology, the invention of the combination of the grading system, grading grain, and grain elevators, storing grain according to their grade, and futures contracts to be able to trade grain according to their grade, that allowed for grain to be commodified, which allowed for people to farm far more acreage, more efficiently, with more predictability, and you had lower prices for consumers and yet more profits for the farmer. And that's because of a right set of innovations that happened in Chicago. The same things were transposed to livestock and timber. And so not just the grain, not just the breadbasket of the nation, but all the cattle and pigs and timbering in the upper Midwest that happened was all facilitated by these urban machinations, which were not well understood and therefore suspect, but in fact were facilitating this expansion. Okay, without spending more time on that, you may be thinking, okay, great, but what about disease, crime, corruption, and other urban disorders? We know those happen too, right? Okay, granted, I'll give you that. There's a basis of truth for some of those things. I think that we always have to consider the extent to which any of those things are urban in nature, or if when you have millions of people, you have more incidents. Certainly the evidence in the contemporary world is that, and New York is an example of this, you can have our biggest city be one of our safest, which means there's not an automatic correlation. Crime isn't necessarily an urban problem. It might be a product of the way we have shackled our cities and their ability to govern themselves with effective resources, but that would be a different talk. Okay, here's a different perspective on all those things that I just said about city, about crime and corruption and disease. In the 19th century, as people were deciding, okay, I cannot live in this current setting. My older brother can. Where am I going to go? Where am I going to make a family? Or how is this going to work? As they were making their migration decisions, what they decided by the millions was that they noticed that cities had water systems that provided abundant drinkable water without each household needing to drill a well. Cities had sewer systems that took away effluents without it producing illness in your backyard. Cities had electric systems when there was not electricity available elsewhere. Cities had better access to health care, such as it was. Living in a city provided broader and more consistent access to education, such as it was at the time. Cities provided more occupational mobility, a wider range of jobs, and easier access to jobs. Cities provided religious mobility. Your worship choices were not limited to the specific churches that existed in a small town or rural area. Cities provided more social mobility, which, by the way, is not the same as economic mobility, even though generations of social scientists conflate the two. Social mobility literally means the ability to socialize with people who you want to socialize with. And the more people there are, the more likely you are to be able to socialize with those people, and mobility in terms of social status, which isn't the same as economic mobility, speaking as a college professor. So all those millions of people moved to cities because it was readily apparent to them that cities offered a better life. Okay, that's history, you may say. Do cities still offer a better life today? Well, let's look at the present. Cities are right now the site of 3 enormous global transformations underway as we speak. One, the political transformations that I've already mentioned, although one additional dimension to that is increasingly people talk about globalization as though it's just an economic factor, but it's not. It's a political transformation as well. And if we imagine a long-term future for this planet, we hope that it includes more international cooperation and international coordination. And despite obvious dysfunctions, the places that's happening and getting going, and it is at the UN in New York or at The Hague, there have to be institutions, and those institutions have to be places where lots of people come together, and that happens in cities. So that's another political transformation at work. But I talk about 3 enormous transformations. The political one, enough of that. Second, a global rural to urban migration on a scale far beyond that 19th century migration that I mentioned to you earlier. In fact, it might be the most, on a scale larger than any demographic shift in human history. More in a moment. And then equally important, but less well heralded, is that cities are becoming, through innovation in urban practices, the solution to the sustainability of the human race on the entire planet. Just a small thought there. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the latter of these 2. First, the global rural to urban migration, and then cities as the solution to global problems. Let me characterize this global rural to urban migration. It's happening in almost all countries on 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and South America. Millions and millions of people are again finding that rural and small town life is inadequate. The available standard of living is not high enough by almost any measure. And so the bottom line is that individuals are deciding that the prospects, again, are deciding that the prospects of urban life are better than rural. But it's not just individuals deciding that. It's at the national level, governments are recognizing that also. The best example, but not the only example of this, is, of course, China. I think a lot of people have studied, to a great extent, why it is that the Soviet Union collapsed, and it had a lot to do with being in an arms race with a much bigger economy. And to match gun for gun was straining the Soviet economy too much. There are other problems also there at work. But one of the least understood pieces is, why did China turn to market capitalism? It's still the Communist Party, but as we all know, it's not communist anymore. It's a very capitalist enterprise in China. Well, the answer is that if they didn't change their approach, there was going to be revolution again. The system in China was doing an inadequate job of providing an adequate standard of living to the billions of people that live in the Chinese countryside. And those people were starting to move to cities and starting to protest in cities. Okay, quick, we've got to do something here. There was a very intentional set of strategies put in place in China of intentional urbanization to build diverse economies in cities, to provide a wider range of jobs, to sustain more lives, to prevent billions of people protesting. It's not an accident that we end up now with 20 cities in China with more than 5 million residents. That's 20 cities in China that would be the second biggest city, at least in the US. And that was because of an intentional effort to say, okay, the rural isn't working, and we want an order that was sustainable, so we are going to facilitate urbanization and facilitate the growth of diverse economies in cities, and that required a movement towards more manufacturing, more industrialization, and actively engaging in the global capitalist economy, in the market economy. Most simplistically, some people describe that when they took, and you see this in the mass media all the time, the description of the rural to urban migration, the statistic that you hear the most is that we are now a world that is more than 50% urban for the first time in human history. That's true, but that doesn't even fully bring home the magnitude of this migration shift. If we take 100 years of European immigration to the United States, the peak 100 years from 1820 to 1920, 1920s, which is when we essentially restricted immigration from the 1920s to the 1960s. So we take that peak of European immigration to the US that I would wager almost everybody here can trace their ancestry to, from 1820 to 1920 when most immigrants came to the US. That many migrants moved from rural China to urban China in 1998, in 1 year. We look at the top 10 cities in the world in terms of population in 1900. And by the way, the size of a city is a measure of something other than just size. Because if you think that all these migrants have a choice of where to go, and they do because there's a lot of places that they can go, the fact that certain cities grow means that based on the information they have available, the prospects are better there. So top 10 cities in 1900, and of course in previous eras there are more barriers to mobility. We don't have perfect geographic mobility. But anyway, top cities in 1900, London, New York, Paris, Berlin, Buenos Aires, Chicago, Vienna, Tokyo, St. Petersburg, and Manchester, England. Range of population of those top 10 cities is from 1.5 million to 6.5 million. Tokyo and Buenos Aires are the only two on that list that are not in Europe or North America. In 2000, 100 years later, there were 32 cities in the world with more than 5 million population. The top 10 cities, I don't have the actual list here, but 32 cities with more than 5 million in population, whereas there had been one in 1900. And current estimates, even just 15 years later, is there are now 52 cities in the world with more than 5 million residents. And of those 52, remember it used to be that there were 8 out of the top 10 were in Europe or North America. There are now only 6 of those 52 that are in Europe or North America, 3 in North America, 3 in Europe. New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago in North America, and not counting Mexico City, because Mexico City, for this analysis, Mexico has far more in common with South America than the US and Canada. And in Europe, it remains London, Paris, and the greater Berlin area. So is this a problem that we have 52 cities, most of which are in the developing world, that have millions and millions of residents? The megacities. Is it a problem? Well, it does present very clear and pressing challenges. But, and this brings me to my third point, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to get it right in a way where we will have sustainable habitation on the planet. I think sustainability is too often thought of as only an environmental concept. Sustainability is about the environmental sustainability, but it is also about economic and social and across many other dimensions. But I would argue economic, social, and political sustainability. That was the calculation being made by leaders of the Communist Party about political sustainability. Okay, so that brings me to this last piece. We often think of these overcrowded megacities that are emerging in developing countries, and we think of slums. And there are incredible images that I think we've all seen, both still images and images of, say, the scenes in Slumdog Millionaire, in terms of the mass media images. And we think of inadequate basic services, like inadequate water, availability of water, sanitation, healthcare, electricity. We think of very sketchy and incomplete higher order infrastructure like transportation systems and education systems. But these new emerging megacities are not just an agglomeration of these problems. They also have a lot to offer. Evidence of that is that millions and millions of migrants have chosen to move there. And we can't discount that. Of course, it's relative to what their other options are. But nevertheless, these cities, with all those shortcomings, are still the better option. So the solution isn't, we need to stop this migration, or we need to get these people out of here because it's terrible conditions. We have to start working to solve those conditions and make those cities work better, which, of course, if you really think it through, as we solve those problems and make those cities work better, it will continue to feed the migration, which is a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Because the rural agricultural life cannot sustain all those people, but for farming to support the planet, we need less people living in the countryside and more people farming the countryside. And the countryside that's not being farmed needs to be forested for the ecosystem so that we can continue to convert carbon dioxide back to oxygen. And we can continue to have a viable, ecological, sustainable system. So if we can find solutions for the problems of providing services and building infrastructure, we can make these cities more workable, more viable, and then this becomes the way in which we can solve and address fundamental problems of the growth of the human population. Now, why do I think cities are the solution aside from the land use issues that I mentioned in terms of use of farming and forestation? Well, there's additional pieces besides the land use efficiency. There's energy efficiency, which has become apparent to us only when it hit our wallets. The rise in people wanting to settle in cities in places where they have choices that are viable, like in the US. If you speak to people that are in their 20s, there's a much higher proportion now that want to live in cities than in any preceding generation for the last 60 years, if not more, maybe even 100 years. And one of the reasons for that, it has to do with the cost of transportation and an environmental sensibility about the use of energy. So cities, medium to high density cities, not sprawling, far-flung, spread out cities like the American model, can allow us to dedicate more land to cultivation and ecological replenishment. But the other benefit of cities is the notion that density comes with its own set of core efficiencies. If you think about the way we live our lives, there are four main components. There's where we work, there's where we live, there's where we shop, and there's where we recreate, where we play. Work, shop, live, and play. Four different dimensions to life. The American model is that all four of those are in distinctly different places that requires transportation to get back and forth. Well-planned, diverse cities can offer all four of those things in close proximity, which means each person's transportation, they need less transportation. It's not just energy efficiency, it's they consume less infrastructure by living in a city. One of the problems that we have in developed countries is, okay, we built highways, and this is the case in Europe as well. Then we need to sustain, replace, or repair those highways. Well, if you have fewer people per mile, the cost per person of replacing them is higher. The more people you have per mile, the more efficient your infrastructure is. And that's just transportation as an example. So if we start having settlement patterns, global settlement patterns that allow those four functions to remain close to each other as incomes go up, as they are likely to, as incomes go up across the globe, and for example, consumption and recreation become actual options, it's important that the consumption and recreation options be nearby, and that the diversity of jobs requires relatively small distances to travel. We can keep a lid on per capita energy consumption. We can keep a lid on per capita land consumption. But you can make these same arguments for other infrastructure. I offered the transportation example. Think about water distribution systems, all those water pipes that you need to lay. fewer feet of water mains per person. Because we're talking about trying to solve these problems in countries that have very low per capita income. We can't afford our infrastructure. How can any other country afford our infrastructure? But yet the standard of living that has been set is trying to reach the basic standards that we have in this country. The richest country in the world can't afford its own infrastructure. Obviously, the poorest third of the world needs a more efficient infrastructure. So not just the distribution systems for water. Think about the efficiencies of systems where water is used multiple times, reclaiming and reusing water, where the first use is for drinking water, but then there are subsequent uses for washing, for irrigation, treatment, and then maybe going back to those other uses again. That can only work with a certain amount of density of use, multiple uses in a close proximity. So that same logic can apply not just to streets and water systems, but to sewers, stormwater collection, and again, that whole idea of more people per mile of infrastructure. This even applies to telecommunications infrastructure and building bandwidth. The prospect of getting more and more people access to modern life increasingly involves telecommunications infrastructure, both internet and cell phone service. And that is possible in a more efficient way in higher density. So let me tell you a little bit about the Shanghai plan for increased density in China as an example of how this can be done when you have a government that has resources to devote to planning to accomplish this effectively. And then I'll wrap up. Shanghai, 30 years ago, was a city of 5 to 8 million residents. It's now a metropolitan area of 22 million residents. It has grown geographically and subsumed a lot of territory, but the planning unit, as they're planning for urbanization in Shanghai, they're planning for 35 million. And they're doing this in a way that is really very interestingly thoughtful. Having learned some lessons, twice now I've gone to conferences in China about managing metropolitan growth, and they're simultaneously, they want to hear me speak about lessons that they can learn from the US, and they hate the idea that they would learn anything from the US. They want to solve the problem. They want to solve the problem themselves, and so I strategically always go there saying, let me tell you about some mistakes that we made. Instead of saying, let me tell you about best practices. We do have best practices that I could share. I'm guessing that it's easier for them to do research into best practices than it is for them to have somebody analyzing some mistakes. But so I've twice been there, and from their standpoint, they're going to hear me speak for an hour. From my standpoint, I'm going there to spend days in Shanghai trying to absorb as much as I can about this rapidly changing city and see what they're doing that makes sense and what doesn't. And they've done some very interesting things as they have planned densification. And lest us fall into the trap of thinking, as I keep talking about denser settlement patterns, that that automatically means a lower quality of life. Let's toss that notion. It's just not true. It doesn't have to be true. It might be if we don't do things well, but it doesn't have to be true. And again, we get into this idea that not now millions, but more than 1 billion people have chosen that lower quality of life because it is better. It's not good enough. There's no question about it. We need to solve those problems. But we should be wary about thinking about the terrible conditions in those cities as terrible and leave it as an absolute. It's terrible, but it's better than their alternative, or they wouldn't have chosen it. I know I've said that a few times. I'm just going to keep repeating it. But so this plan in Shanghai is a planning for a multi-centered city, a multinodal city. You can't have a metropolitan area of 22 million or 35 million and have only one core. And one of the lessons to be learned from the American pattern where it first started to appear, because we rushed to abandon our cores, we established peripheral nodes. And most metropolitan areas in the US are multi-centered cities. Think of it as like a combination of an old-fashioned Toll House chocolate chip cookie, but with a little piece of Mrs. Fields there where there's a big chocolate chunk right in the middle. It's a multi-nodal city with the center node is still more important than the others and bigger, but a multi-centered city. And that's what they're planning for Shanghai. And they imagine this metropolitan region of 25 to 30 million people as having 16 main nodes. Now here's the problem where they come up with a very fixed notion when what it is a very dynamic process, and it's never going to turn out exactly as they imagine. But still, they're planning for a multi-nodal city, and they're planning for the infrastructure to support the development in those nodes. They have the power to control zoning and land use allocation, and between the government power and the government power over the lending institutions, they can facilitate certain kinds of developments and discourage others, because every lending institution in China is either directly or indirectly controlled by government one way or another, if not the government directly, by party mechanisms. China has not converted to free market capitalism. It's converted to market capitalism that is state-directed. And it's a funny hybrid. It's worth thinking through there. So anyway, I'm going to now tell you about a very specific program they used outside of Shanghai, which in an area where they were converting from rural to urban. They called it a home for a home. That's the translation of it. And what it meant was the rural farmer who's not so happy with the standard of living he's able to eke out as a rural farmer exchanges his entire farm for an apartment, a decent apartment, in a new urban development that's going to be built that will give him access to diverse jobs, and it's a mixed-use urban development that keeps those four functions of life close to each other. And the kinds of jobs he'll have access to will support a higher standard of living than what he had on the farm. Now, how does that work? It seems like magic, right? Well, how it works is farms are big, apartments are small. All these farms get turned over to, call it the developer, whether it's government or private sector is a misleading thing to get caught into. It doesn't really matter for the sake of this analysis. All those farms get turned over to the developer, who builds a multi-use urban development that is connected by appropriate infrastructure to the rest of the metropolitan area and provides retraining for the workforce. But because there are going to be 10 times as many people living there as the farmers whose land they took, they're giving away for free 1/10 of the apartments and selling the other 90% at market rate. And that's how they pay for the whole thing. That's how they pay for the cost of construction, the cost of bringing in infrastructure, and the costs of providing the retraining services. It's an incredibly interesting model to think about. And they're doing that all across the Shanghai metropolitan area, having experimented with it in one place. Now, in this instance, that one, the prototype, it was 12 months from beginning to end. Now, it's not always going to be that quick. That's one example in Shanghai. There are other examples in China, mostly, of other best practices that will enable this process of mitigating those problems that we associate with megacities and making these new urban developments actually functional in a way that is not repugnant and makes it even more attractive. And those best practices, solving these urban problems, not urban problems that there may be here or in neighborhoods in my backyard in New York or in Newark or Detroit or East St. Louis. Urban problems that are much greater than those problems. Actually, we have solutions to a lot of those. But they're all outside the US. But that's where, no pun intended here, that's where the rubber meets the road for when you talk about world issues that we face in the 21st century. not the relatively small issues that we have in our own backyard. So that's where I'll end. Hopefully that was provocative, makes you think about some things, and you probably have some questions and discussion.
Go back to this little farmer that has given up his farm to have a park. What happens to that farm?
There's a city there now.
All right. What happens to the food that used to be grown on that farm that is no longer being grown on that farm? What is feeding this mega city?
That's the key point. We need the mega cities to be able to have farms. And it seems like an irony, but it's a key piece. Now, one of the things that's happening is increased mechanization. So a part of this, the plan for this city is multi-story industrial agriculture. The lesson from this, I love farms too. I spend my summers in rural Vermont. I love farms. Farms as we understand them will not sustain the planet. They are great. But without additional mechanization and automation and thinking about things like multi-story greenhouses with solar-powered grow lights, for example, and all kinds of agricultural technology that, to tell you the truth, is beyond my expertise. Without that, we will not be able to feed the planet. Think about what's happened to grain prices. Now, a big part of what's happening to corn prices has to do with ethanol. But there's no question that as population continues to grow, and population will continue to grow because in every one of these countries, lifespan is going up, standard of living is going up, disposable income is going up. Unless we're going to go the route of China and have other approaches to population control, there will be more and more people, and there's only so many acres to cultivate. So we have to get more food per acre. So I love farms, but I think that again, I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here and get people to rethink. I don't believe if we look at the world in a couple hundred years, we will be able to have the New England farm as we imagine it in a Norman Rockwell painting.
Building on that, if urbanization is the dominant trend, what does that mean for parts of our country or other countries that aren't urban?
That's a good question. I think that we're seeing it in a small way of thoughtful approaches to reusing spaces that had been abandoned and an increase in population density. Now, increases in population density can be good or bad. I mean, we all know, I'm sure lots of people here have images floating around in their head, density, I don't want that. Well, I don't want bad density, but there are ways in which we can do it that are not bad. And that's happening in a lot of places. One example, in our backyard here, the US is filled with places that have extensive underused infrastructure, and we continue to build new homes in places that require new infrastructure. And that new infrastructure is, for reasons I've already explained, less efficient. That is changing. There's also a generational change. There are more and more people that as they come of age, would like to live in cities. It's now been almost 20 years of consistent surveys that have done of college graduates, where would you like to build your life? And increasingly, kids that have grown up in suburban locales, they can't always articulate what it is, but they feel as though there was something missing in growing up in the suburban locale and would like to be in the city. Now, that might be because cities are more exciting or there's more cultural activity or all those things. And I don't think we should dismiss those as the idle desires of 20-year-olds. I think they have value. What continues to be a damper on that for us, but does not have to be reproduced in other parts of the world, the damper for that on us is that our governmental system and our taxation systems basically make it nearly impossible for us to have good urban education. because of the way we suburbanized and because of the socioeconomic geography of our country, we can't have good enough schools. So even those people that want to build their life in cities, once they have kids and they're thinking about education, okay, I better move. And that's a primary driver to the along with in the US, which is, I wrote a whole book on sprawl in the US called 20th Century Sprawl. And it talks about transportation policy mated with housing policy that has encouraged Americans to move out of cities and live where there had previously been nothing before. There are cultural values that have nothing to do with government policy, like the fact that we like farms. And wouldn't it be nice to live on the farm even if we're not a farmer? Which is at the root of some of the cultural preferences for suburbanization. In other parts of the world, people might have those same preferences, but that doesn't mean we need to facilitate it when it produces a land use pattern that is unsustainable. Sandra definitely gets first dibs. Oh, that's a good question. And I often fudge on that all the time. I think it's easier to imagine what urban means than to imagine what a city means. In this case, I can answer that in a couple levels. First of all, I'm always thinking in terms of a metropolitan area. So to me, blasphemy as it may sound, Clark Summit is part of the Scranton metropolitan area. It's part of Scranton as a unit of analysis to understand all these dynamics I'm talking about. The political boundaries, not so important. The unit of analysis is a metropolitan region. But at what point is something small town and not a city? I think that depends on the era, because of course we talk about a place with 50,000 that Wittenberg, when Martin Luther went to post the 95 Theses, was under 50,000 residents at the time, but it was understood to be a city. I think that's a changing notion. That's a great big non-answer to your question. It's a mistake to define it purely, as geographers sometimes do, by population density, because there's been we have a lot of very low density cities in the US. Houston, Phoenix, and Jacksonville being like great examples of that. There's some great studies that look at density gradients in metropolitan areas, where you are basically mapping distance from the center and what the density is, or with mapping techniques you can now do that in 3 dimensions. There's a point at which you know that you're no longer in a city, but I think it's a line that's further from the center than most suburban Americans would like to imagine. I don't know if that answered your question.
Do you think that if, since more young people would want to live in cities and will, that the tax base can change and that there will be affordable there will be better public education?
I'd like to think.
Yeah.
The patterns are not reassuring in that regard. To the extent that for all the 20-somethings that stay in cities, and then how many of them stay in cities once they have children, and then how many of them get engaged in lobbying for better public schools as opposed to getting together with their neighbors and starting a community-based private school, or pushing towards school reform that enables them to have a local neighborhood charter school, which doesn't produce fundamental change. One of the things that I looked at is I started doing comparative work, because I got my degree originally studying the US. And I quickly learned, not only because my dean and department chair asked me to teach a comparative course, but also because it was the only way to continue to make sense of the American situation, was to understand other places. And I've been increasingly become comparative, so now half my teaching and half my research is outside the US. One of the things that I see as a contributing factor to understand urbanization patterns is government structure. And we have no reasonable possibility of ever having metropolitan government in the US. Other cities that have less of these regional inequity problems, other countries, are able to have metropolitan government where you can't move out of the tax district, the taxing jurisdiction that pays for education of poor people. But in the US, you can move out of that jurisdiction. So I'm not saying this is politically viable. It's not my campaign platform by any stretch, but I don't see how we can fix urban public schools without finding a different way of funding public education than the local property tax, because of the economic geography that our metropolitan areas have. There's a little bit of change because you do see in more and more places gentrification. Now, gentrification is either a good term or a bad term, depending on your political perspective, what city you live in, whether you're related to a developer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm constantly running into this. In New York, gentrification is a really bad word. And the reason why, I think, is because there are not other alternatives. Every lost unit of affordable housing is somebody who cannot find a home. That's not true for most American cities. Most American cities should want gentrification, because that means exactly what you're asking about, Sandra. It means growth of a tax base, retention of tax base that otherwise would be elsewhere, that provides the wherewithal to continue to provide better services. And that's the political ideology is, does the additional tax base allow you to lower taxes or provide better services? I will show my cards there and say, I think it enables you to provide better services because we are inadequately servicing too many people, especially in the education arena. But either way, gentrification will be a good thing, and it is happening in many, many places. But in all the metropolitan areas I've studied, every time you see a former industrial district or an old waterfront district where the waterfront doesn't matter anymore, and it's redeveloped, and there's now people living there and new businesses and all those things going on, as much as that's great, and it's a growth of the urban tax base, it is dwarfed by the amount of tax base growth in that same metropolitan area at the edge. For every place where there's like a new Riverwalk that is great, that has 40 stores that are all thriving and people living above them, you go to the edge of that metropolitan area and there's a new mall with 200 stores and a new suburban subdivision with 1,000 homes that is going to dwarf whatever you did in trying to revitalize that one urban neighborhood. So even though we're making progress in the core, we're losing ground overall. Sorry.
Would you talk a little bit about those huge African cities that we see on television all
Right.
the time? Are there sensible plans for their development?
There are. I mean, they're at the other end of this extreme when you look at what's happening in the Chinese cities where they have the resources to plan for this urbanization. And you can look at Lagos, Nigeria. There are huge Asian cities outside of China where there's enormous problems. Obviously India, but India is developing as an economy faster. Latin America. The answer is yes, that's where you still have some terrible, terrible problems. But it's also where we are developing some best practices that can start to make a difference. Unfortunately, it's very incremental. It's block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, and it will require that nation's economy to continue to develop and grow, and for some of that tax base to be devoted to solving these problems, which brings us back to this last conversation, which has everything to do with political culture and government structure in these places. Whether those places will get better is different than whether or not they can get better. I believe they can. Whether or not they will, I don't know. Which is a part of my thing here is they must. We need them to.
Well, going to China, when people are moved out of their farm into an apartment building, with,
Right.
let's say 50 in a row that are 40 stories tall, are there some kind of adequate social supports for this transition?
Often not, and that's a problem, but it's a problem that they're learning from quickly. And so when that happens next year, it'll be done better than it was last year. There are numerous examples. The best example, that I gave you the Shanghai example, Beijing, the settlement pattern in Beijing was characterized, like lots of Asian cities, by rows of homes that would have a business on the first floor facing a street or facing an alley with some residents above, but behind it might be an entire courtyard. In Beijing, they were called hutongs were the names of the alleys, and the traditional Chinese courtyard home behind it. And there's been a lot of discussion about the destruction of the courtyard homes and replacing them with high-rise apartment buildings. There's a couple things about that debate that get missed sometimes. Is again, it sounds funny to come from an historian, but the past is the past. Those courtyard homes are no longer one family with an entire courtyard. That one courtyard home now probably has the courtyard mostly filled in to build additional, not very solid structures to house even more people. And what used to hold one family typically holds maybe now 20. And there's probably, whereas there used to be a sink where there might have been running water with one tap and a drain, now what do you do when there's 20 families? They're shared taps. It's not good living conditions. But yet there's somebody there in that courtyard, not all 20, maybe, it's been in the family for generations. They've lived there forever. And you come along and knock it down in order to build better housing, and you're taking somebody's ancestral home. And that's a real debate. That's an important debate. Yet, as a practical matter, the housing that replaces it ends up with, in recent practice, everything but the social support for making the transition. And so they're starting to address that. Not quite so well yet, I have to say. But it's an important issue because there's a lot of transition. The rural version that I talked to you about, turning farm to town, home for a home, they deliberately have, they at least focused on the job retraining. And they are already in the next iteration of that, talking about having the same kind of social services, Chinese equivalent of social workers and other cultures. Community centers are now part of the design, and they're working on those things. I would be lying if I said this is a miraculous recipe that will solve everything. Really, if this were a room full of my colleagues, this would be a demand that people start focusing on finding more and better solutions to these and anticipating all the possible issues. That is happening, but as far as I'm concerned, it can't happen fast enough because, going back to your other question, we have cities in Africa that are millions of residents acquiring hundreds of thousands of new residents every year. And so if you experiment with a best practice and it affects a little corner that has 10,000 residents, what difference did you make if you don't have a mechanism for translating that best practice over and over and over again? And I wish I could tell you that there's a solution for that yet, but I hope that there will be.
Approximately a year ago, I saw a film, a documentary about brand new cities in China that would build high-rise apartments, thousands of apartments, and 0 inhabitants. Nobody on the street, not a vehicle, and they said there were numerous cities like this throughout the country. Do you suppose that's a matter of them being overzealous and building too many, or was it a matter of we'll build it and they will come? I think it's about 2 years ago. Not a soul. Nobody there.
Yeah. And there are a couple of them, and it's a problem. It's a problem when you have the state-directed project like that, because people don't go where you tell them to go once you let them go where they want to go. And so the numbers don't lie in terms of the number of Chinese that are moving to cities. In this case, what happened is they weren't moving to those cities because, well, why would they not move to those cities?
There's nobody there.
That's not what's happening.
Right. There's not a critical mass. There's not, if there's nobody there, then there are no jobs there. It's a circular process. And so the solution to that, using state power is, as they will in China, would be, I suppose, to populate employers there, which then need workers, and there are certainly people looking for jobs. But the problem is, and that's the problem with planning that's done on too high a scale. I often like to make sure that I teach my students to operate on every scale from street corner to nation to international. But when they get to the higher levels of the scale, they still have to go back down. And in this case, planning on this huge nationwide scale, build a city over there because it'd be nice to have a city there. Well, if people don't want to go, what you end up with is an empty city. That city won't stay empty for that long, but it's certainly a problem. It's not unlike on a different scale, because everything in China is on a different scale. we have entire subdivisions and malls that are built in the U.S. that remain empty. But there's a difference between a combination of a developer who made a judgment mistake and local government that chose to encourage him because they saw the potential revenue that might come from that, making the mistake, and an entity the size of the Chinese government making that mistake. But that's the same, it's the same kind of mistake. And it's interesting to think about. I think it's more likely that that Chinese city will get filled than the empty mall getting filled.
My question is similar to that.
Should I wrap up?
Did a lot of those cities or buildings get built because of the Gorgeous Dam project and the flooding, so all those people got flooded out of their properties and had to move to these newly created cities?
No, most of the migration was based on this long developing trend that the subsistence farming was not cutting it. And so it's not just the areas affected by the dam, it's the entire rural countryside of China moving to cities. And that's why there's 20 of them. I mean, they're all over. We hear about Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangdong. You know, I couldn't name all 20 of the cities over 5 million, and I'm in this business. We hear about some of them, but there's a whole bunch of others that we don't hear about. The interesting thing, I mentioned Guangdong, which is in Guangzhou province. They've done a fantastic job at building their city, and it's not an empty city, with transportation infrastructure that makes this city have a fantastic quality of life, even with a very high density. And they do things like, amongst the major pathways that people would walk to get from one particular place to, from a major commuter train station to another place where there are jobs along the way, instead of it being a 40-foot wide sidewalk that's just paved with trash cans at the end of every block, as we're used to sidewalks being, this is a landscaped, slightly meandering, not enough to slow you down, but just to be more pleasant, with plantings and a little water garden that runs down through the middle of it. And that required a little extra width and certainly some extra expenditure, but it makes the quality of life for people doing that much higher. And so obviously that's great urban design. And it's one of those things that costs a fortune to do after the fact, but is not that much more expensive to do when you're initially building it. But the dams were, the other way to look at the dams was an effort of generating electricity, which was needed. How long do you want me to keep going with questions?
About 3 more minutes.
Okay, so let's take just a couple questions.
How do you feel about urban growth boundaries? And also, I hear
Good
now
question.
a lot of older people are moving to cities too.
Yes.
Coming to retire and whatever, that it's very stimulating.
There's a lot more to do in retirement if you're in a city than if you're in a retirement village of either official or unofficial at the edge. And there's no question about that. The other thing, going back to the use of the car in mass transit, is as lifespans continue to increase and the ability to have an active life extends beyond when people ought to be driving. Well, being in a city is a good thing. I say that knowing that I have an aging parent who doesn't drive anymore, and it's a good thing he lives in a city. Because if he didn't, he would be driving, and maybe he wouldn't be around anymore. I don't know. I shouldn't say that glibly, but that's a fact, a practical issue. Growth boundaries. Growth boundaries, again, it's dependent on political systems. In the U.S., growth boundaries have all kinds of problems. In places where you're able to plan urban development before it happens in a different way, they can be a really good thing. The best example of this, of course, is the Portland growth boundary, which has been around for a while. There are other cities that have experimented with this on and off. Melbourne, Australia, has tried to implement growth boundaries 3 times since the 1950s. They initially started it before Portland did. Their plan they had a plan published in the 50s, again in the 70s, and again more recently. And they have some impact. The best evidence of managing growth isn't by those kinds of rules. so much as where it immediately at this line goes from one to the other. It's providing not just more subtle zoning, because really what a growth boundary is zoning. It's more subtle zoning and zoning that is mated to proper infrastructure. The best growth boundaries are where the growth is occurring in a corridor that is well supported, and there's an intentional decision, we're not going to provide infrastructure. So if you don't allow the sewer hookups, if you don't allow the utilities to add more electrical hookups, well, then you won't have development there. And so the way the infrastructure is developed, that's not the way we work in this country. We're likely you could develop there, and then it's the utility's obligation to provide the service. And sometimes there's a hookup fee and sometimes there's not. Growth management can happen with hookup fees that are actually high enough to cover all the direct and indirect costs of that inefficient infrastructure for peripheral growth. But that's not politically viable in most settings in the US. The interesting thing about growth boundaries that it brings up is, because it's zoning, growth boundary is in a lot of ways a taking, which are protected in the Constitution. One farmer, if he, what?
And bitterly fought.
And bitterly fought, and by some accounts, likely to be re-argued in front of the new Supreme Court, because this is a Supreme Court willing to reconsider a variety of long-held precedents. So the zoning power of government is under fire, because a growth boundary is a taking. If you're on one side, if you own a 40-acre farm on one side of the boundary, you've got a gold mine, and if you own a 40-acre farm on the other side of the gold mine of the boundary, you don't. On the other hand, you can remain farming for a long time if you're on the outside of it. And that's been litigated over and over again, and it's, I'm not sure it's the best solution. I think there's other ways to accomplish growth management. I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you all for coming to listen to my diatribes.
Thank you so much, Owen. The insights into the city are important for us. I want to remind you all, and Joanne will pass out some flyers on your way out. We have a lot going on in October. We don't want you to forget the next luncheon on the 22nd, the return of Stephen Kinzer to give us more insights into why we like to intervene in this country, starting from the 18th century. We have two wonderful free lectures coming up. One is a woman who's a vice president at the Library of Congress, who's going to talk about libraries and the moral life. And it's going to be a fascinating evening event, free with a reception to follow. And then there is the return of our heroic prize-winning playwright Stephen Karam, who's going to be interviewed by one of the more interesting conversationalists from New York City, Paul Holdengraber, who will interview him. He is the director of public programs at the New York Public Library, and he's made quite a name for himself, talking to people, just about everybody in New York. So try to get to that. That one's October 30th. And we also encourage you to enjoy the fall at the Ledges in Hawley with our own Jody Dunn talking about and showing us about Georgia O'Keeffe. That's the weekend of November 10, 11. So thank you for coming, and I'll see you all very soon.